So I'm going to get right into the lecture. And then during lab, I'll talk about some of the things that I'm observing on the homework assignments and just in general. But overall, thank you. You guys are doing really well. So I'm thankful that you're progressing pretty well.
Hey, Professor,
Israel.
are you gonna go over our field guide by chance?
Oh, well, one of the things I was going to tell you is that I did go through the field guides. Are you talking about the field guide you submitted, the
Yeah, because I'm
sample?
not even sure if I did it right. I'm pretty sure. I don't know. It's my first
So,
one, so
so for for all of you except Israel, hang on a minute. um, I have provided comments. Let's see, there's Beverly. Um, I provided comments on what you submitted, like literally on the file. I provided comments, and I also may have included comments after, like general to the graded assignment. So you can take a look at that. Now, Israel, yours is the one that I could not open, and I don't know why. So all I got was just a spinning wheel. So I'm not sure what was going on. So can you,
I submitted it in PDF.
yeah, that's the way that should be. I think you did the right thing. So can you email them to me?
Yeah. What's
Okay.
um
Yeah,
what's your
you don't have to
email?
do it now. Just go ahead and email them when you can.
Is your email the one that I received a couple of days ago?
Should be. Yep.
Okay, I got
Yeah.
you.
All right. Thanks. Elena?
1.3 you graded somehow and sent to me that I don't understand something, but truthfully I didn't submit anything. I forgot about this assignment.
So
it's 1.3.
Okay.
So I don't know what's happened.
Okay, I'll take
because
a look
I
at that.
understand very well zoning. I have
Yeah.
some question about zoning, but it's about sunset zone, which additionally like A1, A3. It's a little bit wider.
I think A1 and A3, that's Alaska, isn't it?
Maybe
and
because I found this zoning for ciders, for cedars,
yeah,
cedar trees. Maybe, but
there,
it's not just number; it's with letters.
yeah, yeah. And why they do that, I don't know. Maybe because the continuous states, they can easily number, and then they want to highlight for people, you know, Alaska's different, Hawaii's different. That's the H1 and H2.
Might be right.
Yeah. So, all right. Let's get going. And we'll do our best. So I tried to bring samples for some of the plants, at least things that I could get to. The rest will rely on photos. And we'll go here, go there, and let's see. So the one thing to keep in mind is that this is your time to not only ask me questions, you know, please, by all means, ask me questions about the plant material I'm presenting, but also you should be taking notes. You know, this is, you're going to be looking these up as you study for your exams, as well as the ones that you're doing for your field guide. But generally, this is your time to take notes. And of course, both the recordings and this PDF will be on the module, so you'll be able to look at them later if you need to. Beverly, hi, good to see you. Did you have any questions or comments?
No, sorry. I don't know what's wrong with my brain today. I just completely forgot how to get to the Zoom link.
Oh, yeah. Y'all don't worry about being late. That's okay. You know, things happen. So I'm not at all worried about that. The only thing that concerns me is if I don't see that you're trying to get in, and I may just keep going and going, and you're in the waiting room. So all good. Okay, let's give this a start. So what I'm showing you here, and this is what I'll do for each of them, is a summary of the plants. And we're not going in alphabetical order, you know, starting with the trees all the way down to bulbs. I am trying to create these lists based on what I see is their season. You know, we're looking at the winter and the spring season. So I'm organizing the presentation not only based on, you know, their highlighted seasons, but also when you would probably see them in the nurseries. So if you take this list and go to a nursery, especially one that has a big inventory like Yamagamis or Kings, or there's a few or Summer Winds, you know, there's a few out there. And there's a few in distance. There's Half Moon Bay Nursery if you want to get toward the coast, and there's Sierra Azul Nursery down in Watsonville, which I just went to last week, and they had a ton of stuff. So that's the point of giving you this list. I'm also going to be referencing the families, and it's good to get into the habit of understanding what the similarities of the plants are within families, because that will help you get closer to knowing about the plant themselves. So, for example, the very first one family that's listed is the Amaryllidaceae family, which includes daffodils, but also other amaryllis type plants. So they have similarities, and I will be talking about those with the individual plants. Okay. Okay. So, and this list might get less and less as we go through plants, because we might already be covering them, and I don't want to give you redundant information. Okay. So here's the first one, and Sue, I know you put this in your field guide submission, so this should look familiar to you. What we're looking at is Acer palmatum sangu kaku, and this is a Japanese maple. We looked at a Japanese maple last semester, which was Acer palmatum dissectum atropurpureum. But I wanted to show you a unique one that is specific for the winter. The leaves are very much similar to what you would find on any standard Acer palmatum. If you looked at a straight species, Acer palmatum, it would look like these leaves that are listed, that are shown here. And they will turn, in all the Japanese maples, it will turn to a yellow. It could be a yellow-orange, it could be a red, but mostly the red fall color is with the red summer color. You know, it's rare that I think a Japanese maple that has a green leaf would actually turn red. So anyway, with the sangokaku, or they call this the coral bark maple, and you can see why. It has this very distinct coral colored branching, particularly in the winter. If the winter is even colder, the color gets even more vibrant. So if you can imagine, what was the other, I'm not testing you intentionally, but for those of you who took last semester, what was the other plant that had a coral or a red bark? Do you remember?
The dogwood, the red twig dogwood.
Red twig dogwood, excellent. Woohoo, brownie point. And yeah, that's a completely different genus, that's Cornus. but it has a similar habit of turning bright red during the winter. Now, as the bark gets older, and you can see that in the lower trunk, the color starts to fade, and it gets to be more of what you would think of a typical bark, kind of gray, a little bit smooth. And so in order to, if your design really requires that stunning sculpture of red twigs, you might have to get into the habit of doing some heavy pruning, or direct somebody to do that so that it creates new growth. And that new growth is what's going to be red the following year and the following few years. You wouldn't have to prune it every year. You know, that's something that you would have to judge based on your own design aesthetic. So what else can I tell you about it? It's a deciduous tree, clearly from what I think all our Japanese maples are deciduous. It only reaches about 25 feet tall, and it can get about 20 feet wide. The shape of it is either rounded or vase shaped. And what I mean by vase shaped is that it's very narrow at the bottom and it opens up like a V toward the top. But that also depends on how it's pruned. You know, if it's pruned regularly, it might retain a different shape. With all Japanese maples, the leaves are opposite. They're opposite on either side of the branch. And as you can see, the green, it's a medium green in the summer, and then in the fall it turns yellow with a little bit of orange. And again, with I've mentioned before with Japanese maples, is that they really need to be in an area where they're protected from hot sun. So you can plant this in full sun, but if you want to enjoy that fall color, it needs to be in a location where it's going to be protected, because at that stage, even when they're green, they're sensitive to hot sun and dry winds. Not a good combination. So the leaves will actually burn. I mean, not literally go up in flames, but they will dry out and crisp up and be pretty unattractive. And then of course, if that happens when they're green, by the time they turn color, they're just going to be brown and crispy. So if you see a Japanese maple in the sun, full sun, you'll watch it in the fall and you'll see what happens. The Japanese maples in general require an acidic soil. Their native habitat is more of a forest or edge of forest environment where there's a lot of leaf debris that drops. And after it rains, you know, a lot of nutrients go into the soil. So it becomes much more acidic. They can handle clay soils, but it prefers something that's moist and more loamy. So let's see. Obviously their outstanding feature is the coral bark for winter interest, but also in the fall, it's pretty spectacular if it's in the right environment. For landscape use, you want to use it, you can use it in a Japanese garden, a shade garden. You want to use it as an accent. So if you want it in a place where you know it will be seen in the winter or fall, that's definitely where you want to bring it, plant it for attention. And if you use a row of them, you could use them as a screen. You know, even though it's a deciduous one, you could still use it as a screen. And certainly Japanese maples are actually pretty tolerant of being in containers. I knew somebody who had a dissectum in the same pot for 30 years and they never pruned the roots. It never grew. I mean, it only stayed a certain size, but effectively it was acting as a bonsai. So Japanese maples are popular as bonsais, and it's partly because their roots are really not demanding. So that's, for a container garden, it's an ideal plant. And then there are some problems I mentioned about the sun and wind, but also there are, you'll see when you do the research, there are some insects, particularly invasive shot borer and aphids. And there are some diseases, armillaria, root rot, and verticillium. Now, I want to remind past students, but also the new students, or tell the new students, that when I talk about the problems, particularly when it's insects and diseases, that honestly, don't get overwhelmed by those. I mean, if you start focusing on the problems, no plant is going to be worth your while. The reality is the plants that are vulnerable to pests and diseases are ones that are stressed. You know, they're planted in the wrong location. They're not getting enough water. They're crowded. You know, there's not enough air circulation. It's getting too much water or maybe not enough water, and that causes a different stress. And there could be other plants in the area that are vulnerable to insects, and then it makes this plant vulnerable. For all my experience, I have never seen a Japanese maple infested so terribly with aphids that it had to come out. You know, it's really just a matter of being cognizant, being aware of what's going on with the plant, and once you see stress, addressing the stress so that it's not vulnerable. So that's my spiel. So don't get too overwhelmed with the problems, but you do want to note them in case there's an assessment has to be made on a plant that is stressed. And then for maintenance, I mentioned about pruning so that you can encourage new growth that has that coral bark, but also you also want to shape it so that it has the overall shape that you desire, or your client desires. So given that they do that arching shape or vase shaped, that also lends itself to be sort of like an umbrella. And that means that it could be something adjacent to where a bench might be. So just some things to consider. Okay, any questions about this Japanese maple? No? Okay, we're good about pace here? Any comments? Okay, Arena, you made it in, excellent.
Hi, I was in, I just didn't turn on my camera.
Oh, okay, yeah, no problem. I was worried that I missed you or something, so.
No.
Awesome, okay. Let's go on to Picea pungens Coster. Now, we're going to be talking a lot about conifer trees, which is the evergreen, all the conifers that you can imagine. I know Elena knows quite a few from the Tahoe area, but you know, it's firs, cedars, pines, junipers, cypress, cedar, you know, I said cedar, so yeah, we're going to talk about a lot of them because during the winter, that is when people pay attention to them. And it's either because they're cutting them for a Christmas tree, or they're bringing greens in so that they have that fresh, lively fragrance in the house. But also when everything else or a lot of things are dormant, you know, these really stand out during the winter season. So like I said, we're going to be talking about them a lot. I'm going to try to narrow it down to particular cultivars in this case, which is the Coster, so that you can get a real strong distinction between this Picea and another Picea. Or if we're looking at two different ABs, I want to look at ones that have enough distinct difference that when you're on a test, you know what you're looking at between one and another. So for this one, so Picea pungens, that's the Colorado blue spruce. I'm going to talk about that and then I'll come back to the Coster. So the common theme with the Pinaceae family is that the needles are either in single, which is what they show on the Picea. The needle attaches to the branch by itself. Whereas other ones in the family will be in bundles. And we saw that with like the Monterey pine, where the needles were in a bundle of 2 and sometimes in 3 along the branch. So you know that this is a Picea because the needles are all along the branches. They are, the pine cones are pretty significant. Most of the time when we think of pine cones, we're thinking of pine trees that present them, but also these other species such as the spruce. The pine cones on the spruce they tend to be upright, so they're pointing upward, so that I mean, excuse me, I'm getting off track here. Because I already just made a mistake. Just the opposite. The spruce pine cone actually hangs down, like it droops. And we've seen that with like the fir tree, the Douglas fir, where it hangs down. So sorry about that. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, so generally for Colorado blue spruce, they can get fairly tall, even up to 80 plus feet. But this particular cultivar is the Coster, which only reaches about 40 feet. And another difference with this one and the straight species Picea pungens is that the Picea pungens will have a really uniform foliage along its pyramidal shape. There are no holes or irregularities. But with the Coster, and you can see it a little bit in these photos, or this photo, is that it's kind of irregular. There's gaps, and there's other places where they come out. And that's true as it matures. The needles are stiff, and they're actually, if you really got into the minutia of these needles, or if you really wanted to understand how they're different, and you can kind of see it on the broken needles that are on this picture with the cone. But if you were to cut a needle in half, you would see that it's actually 4-sided. Whereas a lot of other needles, they're just round. So that might be one way to be able to compare with others, okay? They're pyramidal when they're young. They get more columnar, so they're more, because they don't really get wide. As they get tall, they almost look like a column more than that pyramidal cone shape. The striking feature of this is the color. If you're doing a winter garden or you want this to be a focal point, you could, particularly if you were to combine this really striking blue-gray color with some darker greens, because then it will pop out. It does like acidic and moist soil. Um, and it prefers colder climates. And that's true. You'll see in older suburban neighborhoods a lot of Colorado blue spruce, and they'll survive, but they won't necessarily thrive because down here, it's not the right elevation. It gets warmer. They're a lot slower growing, and they can be stressed. So that means that they might be vulnerable to some of the problems, like spider mites is a big one. And of course, one of the biggest problems we've seen in California is that a lot of the conifers are vulnerable to fire. So you want to be very careful where you plant it, how close it is to a structure, especially here in California, so on and so forth. Let's move on. Unless there's any questions, Sunaina?
Could you tell us more about the pine cones? Like most of the pine cones I see a brown color, and this is like magenta color. So does it remain like this throughout?
Yeah, so the cones, that is a young cone that you see there. So they will eventually turn brown, but as they're developing, they're going to start to turn downward. So that, and they're rather elongated rather than round. So I'm going to stop sharing just for a moment so I can cancel that notification so I don't interrupt us. Sorry about that. Go one more time. So they do start with that sort of purpley color, and then they get more brown as they mature. They, similar to what we saw with the Doug fir, they look kind of feathery. They have a little bit of a tail, not as dramatic as there is on the fir. But that is another distinction. Whereas with other pine trees, I mean, actual Pinus genera, they tend to be much more round, whereas these are elongated. Okay, let's go on. Let's see. Okay, so this is another conifer called Thuja plicata, and or Western red cedar. Now, this looks completely different from the previous, but it also looks very similar to an incense cedar, which we studied last semester, Calocedrus decurrens. Quick look at it, they look almost identical. The main difference, though, is the cone. And if you recall the cone on the incense cedar, it was sort of a silhouette that had these little arching, or it had a couple of sections that popped out, and it wasn't round, it was more flat. It more had a profile one way and it was different the other. Whereas these are round, and as they open further, they become more umbrella shaped. So you can see this is not in the pine family. This is in the cypress or Cupressaceae family. And with the cypress family, the cones are typically much, much, much smaller than most pine cones that we're familiar with. In fact, in this family, there's also junipers. And if you're familiar with juniper berries, that's one of the outliers to the family. The rest of them produce these cones that are very small. The needles here are, so this, I should say, this is obviously evergreen conifer. It gets to about 40 feet in our landscape areas. It can get bigger in its natural environment. but only about 13 feet wide. So it'll retain this conical shape. The needles are, as you can see, we call those scales. And it's because they're very tight, they're overlapping. And if you're familiar with junipers, it's very similar, you know, and because they're all in the same family. So there's no dramatic needle like we saw in the last one. And they're in clusters that make the overall appearance of the foliage almost fern-like, like a frond of a fern. And it can give it sort of a shaggy look. So that's going to be something that you want to pay attention to for preference. These trees are native to the Pacific Northwest. They can go inland to as far as Montana. But what this tells you is that you probably don't want to put this in a place where there's a lot of summer heat. You know, so Southern California is certainly not the desert, but you know, they're San Diego, it probably wouldn't thrive very well. So that's something you need to take into consideration as well. It takes a highly acidic soil. So we saw that before, like with Japanese maples, they would be compatible with Japanese maples. You can use them in a container, but as you can see, well, as you can see, they get very large. So how long it would be happy in that depends probably on you churning it from a standard plant to a bonsai. And it might get stressed, so you want to be careful of that. This is certainly great for an evergreen garden, and because of its fullness, could be a screen or a barrier, a very large privacy hedge. But you could also use it in an alpine garden. And I mean that very loosely because, as I mentioned, this is not native to an alpine area. But if you want to, say you have a project in far Northern California or in Oregon, and you want to do an alpine garden along the coast, this may be a way to create that effect. And certainly you could use it as a focal point. And the foliage is good for cut use if you're into floriculture. And really the outstanding features are the color and the fact and the texture and the fact that it's deer resistant. Okay. Any questions? Okay, we'll go on. Oh, Fabi?
Sorry, did you see anything about the trunk, it being like a scale, or were you talking about the needles? I like
The needles.
Okay.
Yeah, the needles. The bark, as you can see in this picture, it has a reddish tone. And it can be, it can exfoliate a little bit. So it's not smooth. It can be confused with the cedar for the same reason. It could even, if you squint, it could kind of look like redwood, but redwood bark looks very different. It just has the same coloring. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, Catherine.
The height you mentioned, what's the height it will reach?
Yes, the height is about 70 feet, but it can get taller if it's in its native environment.
Thank you.
Okay.
I had a question too.
Yes.
The photo on the left side, are those trees like young?
Oh yeah, very young.
That trunk like gets really big.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, what you're seeing, in fact, one of the things that I recommend you do in any of the trees, go to the Cal Poly website, the select tree, because quite often not only do they have, excuse me, not only do they have a lot of photos, but they also report where in California is the biggest species they found of it. And I think that's what this guy is doing here, is measuring, or gal, I'm sorry, not sure. But they're measuring it to see if it's one of the big trees. So yeah, in a garden, it may only, you know, this sample is about 15, 20 feet. But you know, it's going to look a lot different when it's 70 to 80 feet, you know.
Shape
Elena,
of
I
the
think,
right side, shape of that, this tree, like the one the person is measuring, it's not like a typical conifer tree shape. Like it's not pyramidal or conical. Or it's very-
well, I think if you were to stand back from it, it would still maintain that conical shape.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Elena? You're on mute.
I just have a language question. How to pronounce cedar, kedar, or its name, Western red? Cedar?
I say cedar.
Cedar, because
Yeah.
in Russian language, it's kedar, like just,
I have no
letters.
doubt.
Yeah. So I try to say cedar or
Yeah, yeah. You know, welcome to the world of,
because letters spelling exactly the same, pronunciation different.
yeah, yeah. That's why we really rely on the spelling of these. Catherine?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Elena. I'm sorry, Catherine. I'll get back to you. Elena, did you have another
Okay.
comment?
I'm done, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Catherine.
I was wondering, you know, trees, the growth takes, some are fast growing, some are slow growing. So is this, you know, very fast growing trees, or it takes a long time to reach to 70 feet?
So that's a really good question, because if we look at Picea pungens, I can tell you very easily that they are slow growing. And as they mature, they continue to be slow growing. The Western red cedar and a lot of other trees, they can be fast growing when they're established, but then they can slow down a lot. So you kind of have to take a average and make a determination, you know, what you value most. Is it the fast growing when it's young, or is it the slower growth later? I know that doesn't really answer. It's to me, it's a gray zone. In fact, when the cedars in particular, when they're first planted, they can be super slow for a year or two, and then all of a sudden take off and be really fast. So that's a challenge. Okay, we got to keep moving. Okay, now we're going to Australia, and we're going to talk about a few shrubs. So this one is Banksia spinulosa. And I'll show you during the lab time a sample of it that I have. But it's interesting, when you look at this picture on the left, it to me looks like a mugo pine, Pinus mugo. But in closer inspection, it's not at all. Those are not needles. In fact, you can kind of see in the middle photo that the leaves are actually considered broad in the context of Banksia. In other words, it's wider than a needle. Okay, so let's talk about them. Hairpin Banksia. So actually that brings up another thing. You'll see a lot of on the plant list where the common name, it says no common name. And it's because one hasn't been made, or they can't agree on what the common name is. So for a test, you can put no common name, and that would be acceptable. If However, there is an agreement among the naming agencies that the common name is the same as the genus, then it's okay to put Banksia as like it says here. Now this one's a particular Banksia, they call it a hairpin Banksia, and if you look closely at the flower stamens, they're a little bit curved, so kind of like a hairpin. Being from Australia, you know already that these are a very drought tolerant shrub. This is an evergreen shrub, and it gets to about 12 feet by 12 feet. So it can be pretty substantial in size. It's a fine texture, but the needles, see, there I go. The leaves are a bit coarse. I mean, they're rigid. So you want to, but you know, texture wise, you want to call it fine textured. You can see that the leaves are a dark green. They're gray or light underside. And if you look at the flowers, I mean, I think that's the most outstanding feature, right? If you squint your eyes, I mean, I don't know if it's just me, but the first time I saw this, I thought of a cob of corn, you know, you know, standing upright on the branches. And that's pretty typical with the genus Banksia. The flowers can be different colors, but typically they look like these oversized candles on the shrub. And there's actually one Banksia that's a tree. And in fact, I saw that tree in bloom right now at Sierra Azul Nursery in Watsonville. So, pardon me. This is certainly the outstanding feature is the flower. The let's see, the type of garden that you would want to put this in would certainly need to be drought tolerant, or a dry garden or a Mediterranean garden, because if you put it in an area where there's too much water, it's not going to be happy. So certainly that, oh my God, you're going to hate me. I gave you the wrong size. This is the problem when I'm blurring plants. So it's not 12 feet, it's only 4 feet. So sorry, my bad.
Is that 4
Yeah,
by 12?
so I'm sorry?
Is that 4 by 12?
No, it only gets to 5 feet tall by about 5 feet wide. And that's it. So I'm sorry. I already was going on to the next plant, and I shouldn't do that because I'm looking at the time and I'm way behind already. Okay, so dry gardens, Banksia, that being a part of the Proteaceae family, means that these flowers last a very long time. So they're popular in flower arrangement. So you can use it in a cutting garden if you wanted. Certainly giving it enough space. Most cutting flowers tend to be in smaller spaces or take smaller spaces. And it, you can use them in a hedge, but you're not going to want to clip it a lot. As you can see, the flowers come in places where if you cut it, you're going to lose that opportunity for bloom. Okay, so you really want these to keep their natural form. Okay, so one of the major susceptibilities that it has, particularly here since we have clay soil, is that it can get root rot. You really want these to be in a well-draining soil and minimizing water. All right, I'm going to go on to the next one. We can go back to any of these during lab if we need to. All right, this is my favorite. I'll show you these in lab in more detail, but this is Garrya elliptica. And I love their flowers. Can you see my picture, my video? I'm having fun here. They are just these long, long, long flowers. It's probably one of the more unusual blooms that I've ever seen. And this is on a native, which is even more awesome. So Garrya elliptica, silk, obviously coast silk tassel for obvious reasons. And the flowers are actually quite soft. So Garrya is in its own family, the Garryaceae family. There's only one other species or genus that's in that family, and that's the Aucuba, which we studied last semester, Aucuba japonica. And what's pretty common is that the leaves are extremely leathery. They're evergreen, and they produce a fruit that is usually dark in color, although in the Aucuba, it can be red or black. So certainly some of the other interesting things about it is that the bark is, especially on new growth, it has a reddish, dark reddish brown tint to it. But as it gets older, it gets grayer. What you're seeing with the flowers is that they collect centrally in a chain. And the main part of it that you see, which is the top part of it, that's the fused bract. And then the flowers are coming out, which are creating that sort of fringe look. And they can get fairly long. There's a couple of cultivars. One is Evie, the other is James Roof. And they can get to be up to 8+ inches, even longer. So it could be quite dramatic. And of course, they bloom at this time of year. Mine just finished blooming, so what you're seeing is the spent flowers, but they have this creamy color. They start in December and they go through now. Only these plants are dioecious. In other words, there are male plants and female plants. And of course, only the female plants will produce fruit. These are great for a dry garden. They're sculptural interest. They tend to have low branching. So if you want to, this is the one that gets 12 feet by 12 feet. So that's what I was mislabeling. But it has these low branches, and because of its size, if you prune the low branches, you'll get this nice sort of small tree look. Very rounded, sculptural, if you do that. And you really not want to prune this, because the more dense it is, the less opportunity you have for those flowers to hang. Okay? Okay. I'm going to keep going, and then we can pull back if we need to. Okay, Ilex vomitoria nana. So Ilex is holly. If you're familiar with hollies and holly berries during the holidays, this is a very popular type of plant. Aquifoliaceae is actually the holly family, and that typically means that the leaves are going to be rather prickly. They've got little points on them, although the vomitoria really doesn't have that. This is an evergreen shrub. Now the Ilex vomitoria straight species will get fairly large. I think about maybe as big as 10 feet, but the nana is, as the name suggests, is a dwarf. So it gets only to about 5 feet, and it can get slightly wider, maybe an extra foot than height. The leaves are fairly small. This is typically unusual for the hollies, for the evergreen hollies. They're dark green. They're about 1/2 inch to 1.5 inches. And they can start out kind of a yellow green, but then they'll turn dark green. This holly, unlike others, and this is why I'm highlighting it, is that it can tolerate an alkaline soil and is actually pretty drought tolerant. So most of the others, and you'll see in the nursery a lot of the other hollies available, they tend to like more water, good drainage at the same time. So this is a great substitution if we have with our environment. It's also a good plant for hedging and using similarly to boxwoods. In fact, one of the things that I should share with you is that when I studied at University of Virginia, very briefly, we went to Colonial Williamsburg, and Colonial Williamsburg, if you're familiar with it, has tons and tons of gardens. And for the longest time, those gardens were bordered with boxwoods. And we talk a lot about boxwoods last semester. They're the traditional hedge that you frame a planter area, but they were having a lot of problems with the boxwood. But this holly is native to that area. It's native to the eastern United States, the southeastern United States. So very slowly they took out the boxwoods and replaced them with these, and they're continuing with that effect without much change in the look. So it does get these red berries, but they tend to be hidden in the foliage. So if you wanted to bring them out for a flower arrangement, for example, you have to hunt them out. So in essence, this is a great plant for hedges, both formal and informal, as well as topiaries. And the straight version, the Ilex vomitoria, that could be a great backdrop or screen. Okay. Okay, now some of you might be familiar with this. I actually forgot to, I think I didn't move this from the master list. But did anybody have this as a Hardenbergia as one of their plants to study? Have you looked that far? No one? Okay, maybe I did. But I wanted to include it here. So we're looking at this particular one called Minnehaha. So the straight variety is Hardenbergia violaceae, which is the lilac vine, and it indeed is a vine. And I bring it up during this time of year because if you go to the nurseries, you're going to see a lot of Hardenbergia because it's full of blooms right now. There's even a white version. So definitely it's a good time to see them in the nurseries. But this particular one called Minnehaha was an introduction from the University of Santa Cruz. They have a collection of plants that they've introduced called the koala blooms. And so, lucky for us, we have them nearby and it becomes readily available. So this is another Australian native, means that it's drought tolerant. It blooms during this time of year. And unlike the straight version, which it gets to be a very large vine, this is a dwarf. It stays contained to about 3 feet, and it can spread out by about 5 feet. So technically it's still a vine. It just doesn't go anywhere. So a lot of people categorize it as a shrub. So if you say one or the other on exam, I will be okay with that. So it blooms, it's in the same family as other peas, pea flowers. If you look at the flower closely, it looks like a sweet pea in these bright clusters. Certainly this will be a smaller cluster than what's on the straight species. But, you know, this is great if you need something for a perennial garden. It can be an infill, you know, if you want something that is there during the winter when everything else is dormant. It can be a border or a mass, and you can espalier it. It won't be a very large espalier, but you can do that. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term espalier, that's when you train it on a trellis or against a wall so that it's very flat against the structure. Often used for more rigid shrubs or trees, like fruit trees, you'll see are espaliered, and they'll be trained against a wall. Okay, so before I go on to the next ones, we have 3 more. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want to break?
I
Keep
think we
going.
keep going here.
Okay, we'll keep going. And again, if you have any questions, we'll cover it in the lab. Okay, perennials. We're going to go on to perennials. So this is, we actually are going to be looking at 3 different types of Helleborus. So this one, and the reason why is that this is the time they bloom. And I want to show you the differences between the 3 species. So this one is Helleborus orientalis sparkling diamond. And it is native to Greece, Turkey, and the Caucasus. This is a perennial that, common name Lenten rose, that I think really people don't, it's sort of underappreciated. And it's partly because people aren't familiar with them. The other thing is that despite how showy the flower is, they tend to hang downward. And if they're on a low area where you're looking down at it, you're not really going to appreciate the flower. So they can be evergreen, but this picture is one that I have in the garden, and I stress it out. I don't give it enough water. So it looks terrible through the fall when I should be giving it more water. But then as it rains, it sends out all this new growth with the flowers attached. And the flowers are actually really long lasting on the plant, but not necessarily long lasting after you cut them. They say that you need to like burn the end of the stem or boil the end of the stem to cauterize the end for them to last longer as a cut flower. The leaves are palmate, so like your palm, deeply lobed, and they all come from the ground. They're all basal. So everything comes from the ground. There's no trunk or woody branch. This is all herbaceous material. And despite how I treat it, it's very hardy. It needs to be in the shade. And this is great for winter color. Helleborus orientalis can come in a lot of different colors. They're mostly in the purples, whites, pinks, even green. So this is a particular one that has one of the more stunning flowers, if this is something that you like. It can definitely, a shade perennial garden is where this would go. It gets to about 1 foot tall, not much more than that, and about 1 foot wide as well. Okay. One of the vulnerabilities is snails and slugs. So if you're in a place where that is a problem, this might not be recommended without a lot of maintenance involved. Okay. Now for something completely different. This is Aloe arborescens, or the torch aloe or candelabra plant. So this is a succulent, and it actually gets fairly large. Don't let the images deceive you, but they can get to about 10 feet tall and about 10 feet wide. How many know Wilder Ranch in Santa Cruz? No? Okay, there's one. So the theme tonight is go to Santa Cruz and go to Watsonville, because you've got the Watsonville Nursery, Sierra Azul. You've got the Santa Cruz Arboretum, and they focus a lot on these Australian natives as well as other Mediterranean plants that are good for coastal environments. And Wilder Ranch is a place that I grew up before it became a state park. And right next to the Victorian farmhouses, there's quite a few of these aloe arborescens, where I, as a child, used to run inside of them and hide from people. So you've got a little bit of my own there. Okay, it's like I said, it gets to about 10 feet. It produces these rosettes of vegetation, and then the flowers are on spikes, and that's pretty typical of aloes. The flowers go beyond the foliage and have these clusters of very brilliant looking flowers. Very hardy, drought tolerant, excellent for a modern garden or a sculptural garden. You can definitely use it as a barrier if you wanted to put a row of these somewhere. And certainly drought tolerant, I said, and an individual one will be quite a specimen. You know, it can be very sculptural just on its own. Okay. One of the challenges with this one, being an Australian native, and with the Banksia, is that they tend to be frost tender. So this one, if they're, excuse me, just a moment. If the temperature gets below 27 degrees, they can have some problems. It can come back from that, but it's not going to look good for quite a while. Okay, last one, and then I'll rest my throat. And I think you all know this one, or if you don't know what it is, you've seen it before. Narcissus or daffodils, also jonquils. I'm going to show you some examples during lab, but this is a classic. In fact, we talked about it in the last lecture. You want to plant them early. If you want early blooms, you plant them late during the winter for later blooms. And you can see here, they come in lots of different shapes and colors. You know, most people associate daffodils with the traditional yellow with the buttercup. But as you can see, they can have orange and white, all white, and even I've seen some pink ones. I'm losing my voice. So you know that they go dormant after they bloom. That's normal. It means that the leaves are going to start drying out, and you don't want to cut those leaves. You want to make sure that they dry fully to the base before you remove them, because all the energy that's in those leaves will get reabsorbed from the bulb to the bulb. Okay. So I'm going to stop there, partly because you are familiar with this plant, partly because I'm losing my voice. And what we'll do is we'll take our 15-minute break, and hopefully my voice will be back, and we can talk more details. Okay.
When are we coming back?
15 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
6:45. I want to show you a few details from the plants that I do have. In fact, we stopped with the daffodils, so I'm going to start there. So these are from the garden, and you can see I'm not going to put these in the other camera because it'll get messy, but this is what we normally think of as a daffodil, right? You know, there's one called King Alfred that's quite popular and it's bigger than this, but you can see that we've got paper whites, which are the clustered, and I'm not even sure what this one is called, but it's white with a little yellow. And when they emerge, some things that you might not know about them is that they have a sheath in front of that covers the flower. There we go. And as the flower bursts through it, it becomes a dried element in the back of it. You can see kind of right there. So, you know, here you can see a little bit more of that. That protects it. Which is you know, as they're emerging, they can be much more fragile. There's also dwarf varieties. So this one you can see comparatively with the other flower is quite small in a cluster. Even though the flower is the same size as the paper white, the plant only gets to a few inches, like about 8 inches, not even that, maybe about 6 inches tall. Whereas the paper whites not only are more prolific, but they can get to, you know, about anywhere from 12 to 18 in height. The leaves of, let's see if I can do this. So here's a pot of them. And the leaves, this was a paper white that had already bloomed. And so now it's starting to already go dormant. The leaves are very fleshy. So this is typical of the Amaryllis family. They tend to be fleshy. So you can't really confuse it with a grass if you tried to. And incidentally, I've got some Muscaris here. If somebody is not wanting to add a bulb to their winter list, you know, they might consider doing Muscaris, which are incredibly fragrant. They're called grape hyacinth, very small plant, extremely hardy in the garden. The leaves of the daffodil are basal, you know, obviously because it's in a bulb, it produces from that source. And one thing for sure that we've learned that a lot of people don't know is that gophers hate them. So if you have a gopher problem, which we had a huge gopher problem in our garden, we decided to create a barrier of daffodils. So our garden is quite abundant of daffodils because we plant them everywhere. And wherever we see a gopher trying to come in, that's where we plant the daffodils. Yeah, Elena.
What is it? You're talking about it is bird or it is animal? What is it?
What is a gopher? I'm sorry. Yeah, a gopher is like underground. They're an underground rodent that will chew everything.
Underground.
Yeah. If you're familiar with a mole, that's another type of rodent. These underground rodents will burrow through the soil, and when it comes to plants, you can actually watch a plant shake and then be pulled underground, and it will take it away. So in environments, particularly in environments where they are close to natural environments. So we're kind of close to West Valley College, so it's very open. And consequently, there's a lot of gophers in Saratoga. And there's not enough predators to keep them at bay. And so people spend a lot of money trying to do gopher traps and all kinds of mechanisms to take care of them. And we decide, well, we're just going to do something naturally. And we started planting a few, then we're probably in the hundreds of daffodils now. And it creates a barrier in the sense that when they come across them, they know that they're poisonous to them. It'll make them sick. So they'll go somewhere else, meaning they'll go to our neighbor's house. There are times like smaller bulbs, they might move them. So we sometimes have daffodils that are relocated in their tunnels and they come up somewhere else. Yeah, so that's, anyway. So if you have a daffodil, if you have a gopher problem, you know, this might be something. You don't have to do a complete fortress of daffodils, but if you have, a good example is roses are vulnerable to gophers. So if you don't put them in, if they don't put the root ball in a cage, if you plant some daffodils around it, that might discourage the gopher from going for the roots. Okay.
I don't have this problem. I have problem with squirrels. They ate all of my fruits except lime.
Yeah, it's like,
my God.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked enough about daffodils. I want to show you the Helleborus. So I'm gonna switch screens here. It's gonna go gray. And this is the Helleborus leaf. I have to shift where I'm sitting. And you can see they all, you know, it comes up from the ground. It's not, doesn't have a branch. And you can see that they all come to this one central point right here. And in fact, this leaf, I haven't seen this before, but you can see that while they're basal there, this one has divided into these two pieces here. And you can see it's fairly large. I can't even get it in all of my camera. The leaves, if you can see, they have a serrated edge. That's what we call the margin. Okay, and the leaf color is really dark. It's a little bit lighter on the underside. That gives you a better way of seeing how it is laid out. And they'll come from the ground, and it's quite leathery. So despite it being rather delicate appearing, it's a very hardy plant. So what I want to show you next is the flower. Getting water all over my desk, all for you guys. Okay, so there's the flower. I'll show it to you on the other camera if this is looking too overexposed. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so this one is called Sparkling Diamonds. This is, it's got lots and lots of petals, which is why it's kind of popular right now. Most hellebores, they'll have a much more simple flower. You can see the buds there. It has these smaller leaves that come up with each of the blooms. But, okay, I'm gonna switch back camera because I want to show you how it'll be better to show you. So you can see that the flower hangs downward, which if you're looking at the top of it, it's not going to look like much. I mean, you'll see some color, but it really isn't until you get on the ground and look up that you see the bloom. Where that changes is when it produces lots and lots of flowers. And this one is really known to be very prolific, which means that when it gets lots and lots of flowers, you will see quite a few of them. And as I mentioned, if you do the right thing, it's a good cut flower. Okay.
Is it fragrant? Does it have any?
No,
No.
no.
How about the soil? What type of soil?
They're being native to the Mediterranean area, they tend to favor a rocky, even slightly dry soil, but I find that they look more healthy and lush when they get more regular summer water. And we put a fairly deep layer of mulch around them to keep the moisture in. And the soil here is probably indicative of that. It's kind of a sandy loam, and it does well. Okay. Any other questions on either daffodils or hellebores? Okay. I'm going to show you, I'm going to go back to the light box and show you. This is the Banksia. Now this is not the species Banksia. This is a cultivar called, I have to remember what it is, Schnapps something, Schnapper Point. But you can, what I was trying to explain earlier is that the leaves, even though at a distance they look like needles, they're a little bit wider than a needle. And I'm hoping you can see it on here, but the leaves at the very tips have a couple of points. And if you turn it over, you can see how white it is on the underside. See, so green, white, you know, very, very distinct. Okay. But of course, it's the flowers, which I don't have, that are really the showstoppers. And then the last one I'm going to show you are the Garrya tassels. Okay. And this is all one flower cluster. Actually, let me, there. It's hard to get used to this. Okay. And are you familiar with rain chains? Those are downspouts that instead of having a downspout, it has little buckets on a chain that collects the water, and the water goes down the chain and disperses. If you were to look closely at this, it would kind of look similar to that. But I don't know of any other flower that looks like this. It's pretty unusual. So these are spent, they're way past due. If they were fresh, they'd be a real bright white, cream white color. They had a little bit of a tinge of pink in them. And I think there are some cultivars that show more signs of pink. The leaves, so this I'm really impressed with, because this branch I cut off 2 weeks ago, actually even longer. And the leaves are still very pliable. So, I mean, hats off to a plant that can thrive in a very drought environment and still have these leaves that stay very fresh. So you can see that the leaves are really smooth and leathery, thick, but on the underside, it's almost like velvet because it has hairs all along the underside, and it's very soft and velvety. But that tells you that it is a plant that tolerates drought because it doesn't evaporate water very quickly. Obviously, since of the way it's been handling being cut for so long. Okay.